In the Drag King book, published in 1999, Della Grace Volcano writes of their first experience of witnessing a drag king act. I don't remember the first time I heard the term drag king, but I can vividly recall the night I witnessed my first drag king act. It was San Francisco, 1985. The On Our Backs burlesque gang were putting on a strip show for lesbians at the Baybrick Inn. In the mid 80s, this was an entirely new concept in lesbian nightlife. It had the seductive scent of bad girls and butches a flavor, once out of favor, was beginning to take hold. As entertaining as these nights were for most dykes, I felt anxious. I was beginning to worry that maybe I wasn't a real lesbian after all. The strippers were all thin women with big hair and long lacquered nails, a look that did absolutely nothing for me but seemed to drive the lesbian audience wild. So when Martin took center stage, I was flabbergasted, excited, and genuinely confused. According to the publicity, burlesque was meant to be women stripping for women. So what was a guy doing on stage? But Martin wasn't a man. He was something else altogether, the performer Shelley Mars. Not a muscle Mary nor a hairy Larry, Martin was the action man of oxymorons. Even though in my head I knew he was female, the way she performed Martin's masculinity was lewdly compelling and to me incredibly seductive. So this is just one perspective on the burgeoning drag king scene happening in many major cities in the 1980s. But the drag king culture that is more familiar now really comes from a lot of bar cultures in the 1990s. So, unlike the history of drag queens that we've looked at, going from female impersonation, which was couched in queer culture, to different forms of a blues women drag in the Harlem Renaissance in the 30s. We looked at drag clubs in the 1950s, and we've talked about the kind of arrival of a more modern, visible mainstream kind of drag that we see now. But drag king culture had a very different history, and this has a lot to do, of course, with the ways that men and women have been able to access space. So, going through our readings and just thinking about drag kings in general, we're going to begin turning to historiography. So, just a reminder, that's referring to the history of history. So, looking at the ways that different histories are told. Because we often look at, in histories of sexuality, we think about the different ways that men, women, trans people have been able to access um, and have been able to become known as subjects of history. So people that are doing more visible public interactions, so men who have been traditionally more able to access things in the public sphere, particularly men with certain amounts of privilege. If we are basing historical visibility around certain things to the exclusion of others, we will not be able to see private histories, for instance, of lesbian drag cultures and of transmasculine drag cultures. So, going back to historiography, thinking about how scholars approach tracing a history of drag kings. And we're thinking about tracing a history in drag kings not just in relationship to queens, because that sets it up as if they are just a counterpart of one another, as if they are similar in the ways that they've become cultures unto themselves. So there, of course, is connection, but we need to be factoring in how gender and race and class also change the way we talk about drag king history vis-a-vis drag queens. So we'll be considering what factors might influence this invisibility, the relative invisibility of drag kings. So, why is it that drag kings have been less visible and less known in drag and LGBTQ cultures? So, going back to the kind of historical discussions we've had about the LGBTQ movement, gay liberation, where are we going to situate drag kings in that history? Where can we find them? Are they there? Are they using a different name? What are the relationships between drag kings and butch masculinity and then also trans masculinity? And then in drag and LGBTQ scholarship, because the way things are written down really shapes what we know about a particular thing. So if there's nothing written about drag kings, if there's nothing available for scholars to publish and disseminate, that shapes the the ways that we understand who drag kings are and what they do. And it also is important to point out that the way that scholars um, document queer history is also shaped by their own kind of biases. So we're always trying to think not just how drag kings are coming out in particular in particular queer cultures, but also how queer scholars are writing about them. And then how do we see drag kings in contemporary mainstream popular culture? Do we see any examples? If anyone has watched Dragula, which is another drag show similar to Drag Race, but yet focuses more on gothic or gore drag, was the first show that had a drag king and a non-binary participant. So that's one example, but that's a very it's still kind of a more underground show. So can you think of any examples? And again, returning to geographies of sexuality, how do things like space and place play out in this history? We're going back again to the gay bar, the ways that drag queens and drag kings have been central to gay bar cultures. What are the different ways they've accessed space? Who is more visible? And then, of course, what are the differences and overlaps between drag king and drag queen histories and subcultural practices? Thinking in line with the BuzzFeed video where we saw these women being transformed into different figures of masculinity. So, how do drag kings express masculinity? We can think about makeup. We can think about bodily comportment. We can think about gait or like how you walk through a space, how how focusing on the way your hips move as opposed to your shoulders, how that changes the way a body reads as masculine or feminine. What kinds of clothes are you wearing? How are features that are associated with femininity, like breasts, how are they masked in a particular masculine performance? So we often think about binding as being the king version of tucking. But of course, that has a very different experience. But there is still a manipulation of the body that we're seeing. What types of masculinities are available for drag kings to perform? So you'll notice here I'm using masculinity in the plural because masculinity is of course not just one thing. And the particular body that's performing a masculinity, as well as the ideas that they have about masculinity, will shape their performance. So is someone performing, for example, as a gay man, as perhaps informing uh, performing um, a gay male femininity, which has many layers of gender performance in there. How is that different from then performing, let's say, a white heterosexual masculinity? So, in the readings and video clips, can we think about what signifiers of masculinity that drag kings perform? And how do you know these signifiers are associated with masculinity? Where do you get these ideas? So, in this, we're thinking about how gender is performative, how it's composed of things that we see in the world, that we are taught, that express a particular idea. So, we're going back and unpacking masculinity and femininity not just as facts, but as performances, as effects. Historiography and intersectionality. So we're turning again to thinking about the way that we're going to be reading drag kings. So how do things like race and racial signifiers impact the ways in which different masculinities are represented and performed? What can drag show us about the ways that masculinities of color, particularly Black masculinities, are culturally understood vis-a-vis white masculinities? If you're familiar with drag king scenes, you do find quite a few performers that will use drag to kind of poke fun or parody dominant masculinities. And that has a very different effect than performing, let's say, Black masculinities. What are some of the concerns that different feminists have raised about drag kings and masculine performances? So, of course, again, we're using feminists in the plural because there's not one feminist stance on drag. But from our readings, we see that there has been critique from certain radical feminists about the place of drag kings, about masculine performances. And we also see people question the ways that drag kinging can be used for a feminist aim. So, how can drag kings how can drag kings potentially, replicate forms of patriarchy, or how can they potentially challenge patriarchy through gender performance? And again, when we're thinking about the claims that different camps, different feminist camps, or different scholars are posing about drag kinging or masculine gender performances, we want to be thinking again what assumptions might underpin those concerns.